I wanted to talk Carl Froch briefly. It seems very, very clear to me Carl Froch doesn't want to fight James DeGale. That fight's been available to him for a very, very long time. James DeGale's his mandatory. They have the same promoter. In my opinion, that's a pay-per-view fight in the UK. There's money there. If Carl wanted that fight, it would have happened. It would have happened on January the 31st at the O2, which was what Eddie Hearn had initially booked that venue for. Carl clearly doesn't want to go down that route. For me, well, not really for me, I think it's quite clear, Carl's preferred option is Cesar Chavez Jr., Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. There's a few obvious reasons for wanting that fight. It's pay-per-view both in the UK and in the US. Chavez Jr. is a massive draw who brings huge glamour, huge money and a huge fan base to the occasion. It's in Las Vegas, which is apparently Carl Froch's dream to fight there. And in my opinion, it's a much more easily winnable fight for him than fighting James DeGale. You know, look at how Chavez Jr. got outboxed by Sergio Martinez. I know Chavez Jr. has some capability. I know he hits hard. I know he's got an iron chin. But if we look at the way an ageing Sergio Martinez was able to outbox this guy, in my opinion, Carl is a favourite going into that fight. Especially if we then consider Chavez's subsequent performance against Brian Vera, where he really sort of lumbered to a win. For me, the Chavez fight is the fight Froch wants. The DeGale fight is the fight he wants to avoid. I think he doesn't view the risk-reward factor with James DeGale high enough. And I don't blame him from a business perspective, although it is the fight I want to see from a fan perspective. Now, before I touch on the other option, which is what this video will focus on, let me also say I don't genuinely believe that Carl is ready to retire. I like Carl Froch. I like him as a fighter, and I find him quite a funny guy. So I don't want anyone thinking that I'm being critical of Carl Froch when I say this, because as I say, I like him as a personality as well as a fighter. But this is a very, very arrogant guy. This is a guy who is, going around calling himself an international superstar. This is a guy who was one of the most underrated fighters a year or two. I know his legacy to hardcore boxing fans is spectacular. But let's be honest, Carl Froch is a huge celebrity figure. Carl Froch as a sort of guy a man in the street knows and looks up to, in my opinion, is more of a recent invention. To my eye, Carl Froch has only become this sort of celebrity superstar more recently, specifically revolving around the two George Groves fights. Nothing creates interest with like the build-up those two fights had, like a huge domestic rivalry, like the first fight at the new Wembley Stadium. For me, Carl Froch's celebrity is a recent thing. And I think the kind of guy Carl is, he's quite, as I say, don't take this as a criticism, but he's the kind of guy who's a bit hungry for fame. He'd put himself out there doing other TV shows. He's hardly a reclusive guy. And I don't think he is ready to hang up his gloves just yet. Especially, I know he made huge money against George Groves in the second fight at Wembley. I understand that. But Carl Froch's earning potential now is the highest it's ever been. 3 or 4 fights ago, when Carl Froch was fighting, Glenn Johnson, he fought a guy, I can't even remember his name, it was a light heavyweight who dropped down in weight. Carl wasn't making millions upon millions for those kind of fights. His earning potential, which I'm sure has been respectable and very, very strong to the man on the street, is now at superstar level. the pay-per-view attached to his name is more valuable than ever. I would imagine Carl earned more in that second fight with George Groves than all of his other fights put together, including fights against Bute, including fights against Ward, including the first Groves fight. I imagine he made more that night than all of those fights put together. And I imagine there are now fights out there for him that could net him a similar amount. I know Carl Froch has huge wealth and doesn't need to fight to put food on the table for his family, but I still believe there are fights out there that could, say, increase his wealth by 40% of what he's got, of what he's earned. The Gale at Wembley, Chavez in Vegas, and the other fight, Golovkin, that I'm about to come on to. My point is, with Carl Froch being the kind of character he is, and with the fact that his earning potential and his celebrity is at the highest it's ever been, in my opinion, I'm not sure he's ready to retire. I know there's a counter-argument that says he's now comfortable, why put himself through that anymore now he's got that comfort. But I don't think this is a guy who settles for comfortable. I think this is a guy who puts himself out there, chooses to throw himself in the public eye, chooses to be a celebrity and an international superstar, as he calls it. And I'm just not sure, at the peak of his powers, at the peak of his earning potential, he's going to retire. Now, I've already discussed he won't take the Gale fight. I've already discussed he wants the Chavez fight. I don't think that Chavez fight is going to happen. Let's not forget, after Froch beat Groves the first time, he was ranting on and on and on about how the Chavez fight was on the table and how he was negotiating for it. Well, you know what? They never reached a deal that time. All in all, they must have been negotiating with Team Chavez in some form or another for 6-9 months, and they haven't reached a deal yet. They still haven't booked a venue, they still haven't started selling tickets, they still haven't even announced a fight. Now, Chavez, I saw a recent video of him, and the guy looks ridiculously overweight again. I'd guess he looks in the cruiserweight division. I'm not sure Chavez is ready to fight, especially ready to take a fight that's so risky for him as a Carl Froch fight. I'm also not sure if Chavez will fight with the legal situation he's in, where it seems unclear whether he promotionally belongs to one promotional company or is a free agent. It seems that there's a big debate as to whether he is a free agent or whether he's got this promotional agreement, and I don't think he will necessarily fight until that's resolved. My point is, Froch is getting rid of the Gale fight so he can fight Chavez, but I don't think Chavez is going to happen. I think if it's going to happen, it would have already happened. I think the negotiations have been going on too long. I'm not 100% convinced Chavez wants it. He's not in shape at present. I saw this video of him on Instagram relatively recently. He's not in shape. He's been inactive for a long time. Does he want to jump straight into a fight at the top of the division where he's likely to lose? And if he did want to do that, why was he messing around with a comeback fight against Brian Vera last year, So, I acknowledge the Chavez fight could happen. There's certainly a commercial value in it happening. But my gut instinct is that's not going to happen. Now, if we look at what other fights there are, there's the Mikhail Kessler free fight. But who really wants to see that? Is there anyone out there who thinks Mikhail Kessler, who's been inactive since he lost a clear, I'm not saying it was wide, but it was a clear unanimous decision to Froch? He's 2 years older, it must be 2 years. He's 2 years older. He's got 2 years of ring rust and inactivity. Froch dealt with him that day. I'm not saying it was an easy fight. I'm not saying it was a walk in the park, but Froch dealt with him. Then there's the George Groves fight, the third fight. But does Carl want to go down that route again? Is it going to be so easy to sell a third fight after both of the first fights have ended in knockout? If it was 1-1, it would be a big fight, but let's face it, it's 2-0. So I don't see Kessler happening. I don't see Groves happening. I don't see Chavez happening. And I don't see De Gale happening. Andre Ward is a fight that could feasibly happen. But I don't think the risk-reward adds up there for Froch. Again, Ward is a tricky fighter, as is Andre Durrell, another name. You know, these two guys, both rematches for Froch. Andre Ward, it would be the opportunity for Froch to climb really high in the pound-for-pound list. It would be the opportunity for Froch to be considered the #1 super middleweight. It would be the opportunity for him to say he's avenged every defeat on his record. But I think Ward beats him, and I think Froch knows that. And with Andre Durrell, that's an interesting fight for a hardcore boxing fan. But I just don't think it sells to the casual fans. And I don't think the money's there to interest Froch for what would be a very tricky fight. So I actually think that Froch, Gennady Golovkin, is very, very possible. Eddie Hearn's talked about this fight several times. And he said Golovkin's market value means that it's not pay-per-view in America. Now let's be honest, Golovkin, his profile is raising very, very much at present. The guy is one of the most discussed fighters on YouTube. He's one of the most discussed fighters on any boxing forum I read. This is a guy people consider a very, very serious fighter. Stylistically, Froch versus Golovkin would be a great fight. Let's not forget, Golovkin is also fighting Martin Murray, another British fighter. So his profile, at least among the British fans, is going to go up again. That fight, I believe, is on Channel 5 terrestrial TV. You know, his profile is going to be at an all-time high in Britain after that fight. I don't see Murray troubling Golovkin either, so we'll assume he gets through that. Now, with a Golovkin-Froch fight, I think the money is there. I think that sells out Wembley Stadium. I think that does huge pay-per-view buys in the UK. If that fight is in Vegas, I do believe it could do low to respectable numbers in Vegas. And very strong numbers in the UK. Especially if Eddie Hearn put on a UK-based undercard and then it went out to the States. I think there is enough money in that to make that happen. Now, if Froch did that, and if he was successful, he's a guy who seems to care about legacy, Froch. He often refers to his legacy and the opponents he's faced. But if he became the first man to topple Gennady Golovkin, you would have to give him maximum respect. This guy, Golovkin, you know, he's knocking out everyone. He looks unstoppable in the middleweight division. I think this fight is possible. As I say, I think he'd prefer Chavez, but I don't think Chavez is going to be available. Let's think here. Gennady Golovkin is a good fighter. I'm not going to say he's a guy who just relies on power. Clearly, he's got more capability and more skill than that. However, at the minute, he's winning all of his fights by knockouts. Let's remember, knocking out middleweights is one thing. Knocking out super middleweights is another thing altogether. Especially when that super middleweight is Carl Froch, who has one of the best chins I've ever seen. You know, Carl Froch's chin is pound for pound, in my opinion. If we look at some of the punches he's taken, you know, that George Groves punch in the first round of their first fight, that would have knocked out an elephant, that punch. Yet Carl Froch, you know, gets up again. So Golovkin would not only be facing the most durable, strongest chinned opponent that Golovkin's ever been in with, but he'd also be doing it at a new weight division. Now let me talk further about that new weight division. In my opinion, Golovkin is not a very small middleweight, but he's on the smaller side of middleweights. If we look at middleweights like Marco Antonio Rubio, Martin Murray, Chris Eubank Jr., it is clear that there's guys who fight at 160 who, put simply, are much bigger men than Gennady Golovkin. Much bigger men. I read a very interesting article about the check weights for the Golovkin-Rubio fight. I know Rubio missed weight that fight, but I believe 30 days out, Rubio was something like 8 or 9 pounds heavier than Golovkin. You know, Golovkin was, I think, it was either 165 or 167 pounds 30 days out. In other words, Golovkin isn't cutting a ridiculous amount of weight to make middleweight. He's probably not dehydrating to make the middleweight limit. Looking at the size of him, looking at his structure, looking at his size, and looking at his check weights, I don't think he's tight at middleweight at all. I even wonder whether he can make light middleweight. But for him to step up and face 168, you know, I think he's possibly already facing bigger men at middleweight. Yeah, well, I think there's not much doubt in that, actually. Marco Antonio Rubio, his last fight, Martin Murray, his next fight, I think they're both obviously bigger men than Golovkin. So for him to step up a whole nother division where he's already let's say a below average size middleweight, and this division is 8 pounds apart, so it's a reasonably significant jump. I think that's a big ask. Now, I'm not saying Golovkin can't win fights on points. Clearly, he's got amateur pedigree, technical capability. He's got attributes above and beyond his power. Please don't comment saying I'm not respecting his other attributes. You know, because I know Golovkin can fight. It's not just a big puncher. But Golovkin is winning his fights by knockout at present. That's how he's taking care of business. The way he's fighting is front foot heavy, aggression, coming forward. He hasn't shown too many other dimensions to his game. Now that's because he's got a winning formula with this coming forward and, you know, knocking people out. And why should he change that? But I just wonder, against a much bigger man, against a much heavier man, and against a man with one of the hardest chins in the business, is Gennady Golovkin going to be able to walk through Carl Froch the way he's been walking through the likes of Marco Antonio Rubio? And I think the answer to that is no. Let's not forget the Curtis Stevens fight. You know, Golovkin won that fight, but Stevens was able to go deep in that fight. I think it was something like round 8. And I think it was a retirement. I need to box check that. So apologies if I've got that wrong, but I think Stevens retired after 8. You know, if a guy like Curtis Stevens, who's a good solid yardstick, you know, goes 8 with Golovkin, I think people who are saying, oh, Golovkin knocks Froch out in the first round are idiots. You know, how can you say Carl Froch gets knocked out in 1 or 2 rounds when Curtis Stevens goes 8? You know, Froch is a much bigger man. Froch has got an iron chin. Now, with Gennady Golovkin, I do not doubt he is a top fighter. I do not doubt he is probably the best middleweight out there. I would pick him over Miguel Cotto if they fought. But what I would say is he hasn't fought the very best of the middleweight division. Sergio Martinez, Peter Quillen, Miguel Cotto, Hassan Ndam and Jikam, who I rate very highly, Andy Lee, Billy Joe Saunders, who I also rate very highly. He's faced respectable competition. He's faced top 10 competition. Certainly Daniel Gill I'd consider a top 10 middleweight. Certainly Martin Murray I'd consider a top 10 middleweight. Assuming Golovkin beats Murray. But I don't think he's faced a guy who I would consider to be a top 5 contender in the middleweight division. So I think, whilst my best guess is Gennady Golovkin is the best middleweight, for me it's a huge jump to say that just because he... For me it's a huge jump to say that a guy who has never beaten a top 5 middleweight can step out of his comfort zone to a division of bigger, heavier men and beat the widely regarded number 2 in that division, who is specifically known for his iron chin. Because let me be honest, I don't think Golovkin knocks Froch out. I think Froch is near impossible to knock out. I think you need a sledgehammer to knock Carl Froch out, and I'm not even sure that does the job. You know, Froch is bigger, he's stronger, he's taller. He'll have a weight advantage, and he's got that chin. For me, if Golovkin is to beat Froch, he's going to need to outpoint him. But Froch, while Froch isn't the most advanced technician, he isn't the most advanced athletically, he hasn't got the strongest amateur pedigree. But one thing I'll say about Carl Froch is he always finds a way to win. Let me give 2 examples. When I say he always finds a way to win, I know he's lost 2 fights. But what I'll say is time and time again, against the odds, he finds a way to win. Look first at the Andre Dirrell fight. Look secondly at the George Grove 1 fight. This is a guy who was clearly outgunned in the talent department, in the athletic department, in the technical department, by both of those guys. You know, if you look at the first 2 or 3 rounds of that Dirrell fight, the first 2 or 3 rounds of that George Groves fight, George Groves 1, it's near impossible to see Carl winning. You know, the guys against him they just look a league above him. You know, Andre Dirrell, the jab, the movement, the athleticism. If you watch those first 3 rounds, it's impossible to see Froch winning, in my opinion. George Groves, the way he was able to hit Carl, the way he was able to drop Carl, you know, the sort of speed and power he carried. Again, how on earth do you see Carl coming back from that if you just watch the first couple of rounds of those fights? Yet he is a guy who finds his way to winning. And he does have certain attributes over Gennady Golovkin. He's a rangier man. You know, if you look at the way Froch used his jab in that Mikhail Kessler fight, and I know his jab is not consistent across all his fights, but if he established that early, got working behind it against a smaller man, it could be an effective weapon. You know, for me there's a few ways to beat Gennady Golovkin. He may be an excellent back foot fighter, but to me he has not proved that at an elite level. How will he cope if Carl Froch walks him down, pressures him, big mans him, pushes him around, forces him on his back foot? Gennady Golovkin may adapt. He may be brilliant on his back foot, but he hasn't proven it in a professional ring, to my eye, at an elite level. And you don't want the first time to be proving it when you're facing the number 2 guy in a division you've never fought at before. So number 1 way is to push him back and to sort of put him on his back foot, see how capable his back foot boxing is. The second thing is, I've seen quotes on boxing forums from people who've supposedly sparred with him. There seems to be some school of thought that he could potentially be vulnerable to bodywork or to inside game. I've heard trainers comment that he won't like it if he gets hit in the ribs, etc. Now, Carl Froch, again, I'm not saying he's like some sort of lethal inside technician here, but this guy knows how to scrap. He knows how to rough you up on the inside. Look at that Dirrell fight. Look how rough and unpleasant he makes it for Andre Dirrell throughout the course of that 12 rounds. You know, when Golovkin's up close against a stronger, heavier, bigger, taller man who's as rough and as violent as Carl Froch can be on the inside, let's see how he likes that. Again, I'm not ruling out that Golovkin could adapt. I'm not ruling out that Golovkin could do it, because he hasn't, there's no proof he can't. But what I'm saying is, the first time to sow these attributes, sowing the inside game, defence, sowing the, you know, the back foot boxing, you don't want the first time to have to prove that in a professional ring, to be in the biggest fight of your life. I mean, this is why, for me, Chris Eubanks Jr. came up short against Billy Joe Saunders. This is why, to my eye, Deontay Wilder will come up short against Bermane Stiverne. Because you don't want to learn these things. You don't want to do them for the first time in a professional ring. And don't tell me about amateur experience, because it's a different game to professional experience, with small gloves, without head guards. You know, Golovkin hasn't shown back foot capability in an elite fight at middleweight, let alone at super middleweight. The first time he should be in a fight where he's tested in that way should not be the biggest fight of his life. So, Froch, I think, could test Golovkin on his back foot by big manning him. Froch could test Golovkin to his body and on the inside by, you know, by using similar tactics to like the Andre Dirrell fight when he got inside in Dirrell. And finally, let's be honest, Gennady Golovkin, I had one guy on my previous video telling me that he's an elite defensive fighter who's got the best defence stats in the game. Maybe that's the case, because if you go in and you knock an opponent out in 30 seconds flat who's too scared to throw anything back, maybe it makes you look very, very good defensively. Maybe his stats against Marco Antonio Rubio were decent defensively because, you know, he destroyed the guy so quickly. But the way he got caught by Daniel Gill in that fight, and I know he knocked Daniel Gill out, but the way he did that, the way he got caught, the way he left himself open, and to be fair to him, his chin held up on that occasion. But, as I say, I believe this guy is smaller than average for 160. He's going in against a genuine 168 pounder. I'm not saying Carl Froch is the biggest puncher in the world, but in his last fight, in fact, in two of his last fights, in his last two fights, he knocked out a guy considered large for 168, who had never been stopped before. He left George Groves quivering on the floor, like he'd been shot with a sniper rifle. Now, Golovkin hasn't given me huge concerns about his chin, but you don't need to have a dodgy chin if you're hit by a much bigger, stronger man. And if Carl Froch was hitting Gennady Golovkin instead of Daniel Gill in that exchange, there is scope against a smaller man that Gennady Golovkin would find himself like George Groves, lying on the floor and twitching. So in my opinion, this fight is possible. The Gale's not happening. I don't see Chavez Jr. happening. I may be wrong on that. I acknowledge that fight is a possibility, but my instinct is that it's not happening. Now, I do not buy into this fact that Golovkin can walk through Carl Froch. Nobody can walk through Carl Froch. Andre Ward, the pound for pound number 2, couldn't walk through Carl Froch. George Groves couldn't walk through Carl Froch. John Pascal couldn't. Jermaine Taylor couldn't. Arthur Abraham couldn't. Dirrell couldn't. The list goes on. Kessler couldn't. Golovkin. Curtis Stevens took Golovkin rounds, big rounds, 8 rounds I think. Why can Froch not stay on his feet against him? Of course he can. And I think that if we consider, just for 1 second, that Froch can live with the almighty power of Gennady Golovkin for a few rounds, I think there are 3 separate and distinct ways that Froch can win the fight. I don't buy into Golovkin being a defensive genius. And I think Froch could knock him out if he leaves himself open like he did in that Gill fight. And if Froch is able to land a punch like he landed on George Groves. Secondly, and this is one of the problems with fighting guys who are so within your comfort zone. You know, I'm not saying it's Golovkin's fault. I'm sure he's been avoided. It's not that he's ducking people. I'm not suggesting that. But the fact he's only faced opposition that he can just dominate and he can just walk through mean that we haven't seen him fully tested. As I say, I don't believe he's fought a top 5 middleweight. He hasn't fought someone who's got an elite electric movement. He hasn't fought someone who's got sort of hit and run with a jab. He hasn't fought a devastating knockout puncher. You know, fights like Hassan Ndam, who can move so well. Fights like David Lemieux, who can punch so hard. You know, these fights are this sort of experience he needs before a Carl Froch fight, in my opinion. Because at present, and I'm not saying he doesn't have those capabilities, but I'm saying at an elite level, he has not proven that he has an elite inside game. Specifically with regard to sort of grappling up close and sort of getting hit to the body. He's not proven that he can fight on his back foot. He's not proven that he's a world-class defensive fighter. So I think there's 3 ways Froch can beat him. The knockout, George Groves style, putting him on his back foot and seeing if he knows what to do. And finally, sucking him into a brawl, taking his power and coming back, roughing him up on the inside, attacking those ribs. Let's see how he likes it against a man who's much bigger than him. Golovkin's one of the most popular fighters on the online boxing community. I get lots of comments here with people tearing into me, I'm sure. But am I being that ridiculous? Gennady Golovkin has never fought a top 5 middleweight. I'm sure the majority of viewers agree with me on that. You know, David Lemieux, Peter Quillen, Hassan Ndam, Sergio Martinez, Miguel Cotto. There are other names that just aren't springing to my mind at this particular point. You know, Daniel Gill, he's there or thereabouts, but he's not genuinely top 5 in my opinion. Am I being that ridiculous? A guy who's never fought a top 5 middleweight. A guy who has never fought, a guy who's small at middleweight, who has never fought a top 5 middleweight, who in an elite level pro fight has never shown back foot boxing, or the ability to take sort of inside punishment to his ribs and to the body. Going up against a guy, a weight division above, who's been in so many wars. Am I being ridiculous for suggesting that Golovkin could find it tough? Or is it more ridiculous to say that after all Froch's fights where he's never been stopped, a smaller man who's untested at a top 5 level is just going to walk through Froch in 1 or 2 rounds when Curtis Stevens went 8 with him? Let me know your thoughts. Thanks very much for watching.